Hi everyone, welcome to today's event. Special thanks to South Asian Heritage Month for hosting us as part of a thread of LGBTQ plus programming throughout the month. We're living in times saturated with attempts to document new or hidden histories. Heritage projects, especially LGBTQ plus heritage projects, are proliferating. But what are the stories being told whose voices are coming through? It's striking just how many LGBTQ plus history and heritage projects, especially in the UK, continue to tell a celebratory story of gay liberation that are often exclusively white, or that talk about Black LGBTQ plus activism without understanding the incredible significance of political blackness for people of colour from the 60s onwards in the UK, for example, where solidarity was an essential element of resisting a state hostile to all people of colour. You can't tell a story of LGBTQ plus rights or lives without telling a story about us. We are experts in resistance, especially creative resistance. Welcome to everyone from your hosts, me, Charanjit Man, Pavan Dal. Pavan, can you give us a wee wave? He's not going to wave yet. And someone I'll be handing over to in a minute, Rohit Dasgupta, to chair our discussion. He'll be in charge of asking questions at today's panel. We're part of a team that makes up Cross-Border Queers, the story of South Asian migration to the UK, a research project funded by the British Academy. We've been trying to challenge the hetero-washing of migrant histories and the whitewashing of queer histories in the UK through collecting oral histories and considering them alongside creative work over the decades in archives which give us glimpses into the past. In today's panel, we'll be talking about LGBTQ plus lives and activism across the South Asian diaspora from the 80s to today. And I hope for some people watching this today, that will be the entire span of their life, or maybe even longer than they've been alive. For example, what changes when publications printed on paper, stapled by hand, addressed by hand, posted, waited for, anticipated, are replaced with instant connections of a digital world? Are we more or less connected? And how do those lateral connections across the diaspora work? Or are we more rooted in a nation now? And what about our alliances and solidarities? Who did we stand with together then? And who do we stand with now? What's changed? I'll be keeping an eye on the questions coming in from YouTube, but there are other ways of interacting with us too. Rixar has been helping us on the project. Rixar, can you tell us a little bit about our Twitter presence?
Hi everyone, I'm Rixar. If you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube, I'll be there to help you with the questions in the comment section. So don't worry about that. Your questions will get to the host, and I'll be live tweeting about the event throughout. So please do follow us at CBQ Desi on Twitter.
Thank you, Rixar. Thank you. And now to introducing our panel. Shundeep Roy is a writer and radio host currently living in Kolkata. He was the editor of Trikone, the world's oldest South Asian LGBTQ magazine, for 52 issues. He is currently a columnist with Mint Lounge and The Hindu in India, and hosts the Shundeep Roy Show on Indian Express. His weekly audio dispatch from Kolkata airs every week on public radio in San Francisco. He has been a recipient of various awards, including the Seigenthaler Excellence in Radio Award, the Visibility Award Award from Living Well Project, the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association Award, South Asian Journalists Association Award. His first novel is Don't Let Him Know, and won the Lico Award for LGBTQ writing from Humsafar Trust. Award-winning London disc jockey and trailblazing broadcaster DJ Ritu is the voice behind the UK's definitive, independent global music show, A World in London. Her 35-year career includes 2 decades at the BBC, co-founding cult label Outcast Records, and touring in over 35 countries as a band leader and solo artist. She is a pioneer of the 1990s Asian underground scene, founding clubs, radio shows, and bands, and was a key catalyst in launching the careers of many other artists. Ritu is also the founding CEO of UK's longest-running Asian music club night, Club Gali, 26 years, and Kuch Kuch Bollywood Nights. That's been 21 years. Ian Iqbal Rasheed is a poet, curator, screenwriter, filmmaker, and activist. Of Muslim Indian ancestry, he was born in Dar es Salaam, grew up in Toronto, and now lives in London. Ian's work, activist and creative, is concerned with migration, race, sexuality, desire, and how they intersect and conflict. The exploration of diasporic South Asian queer identity is a regular theme. Feature films he has made include the award-winning Touch of Pink and How She Moved. He has curated film programs and exhibitions for several renowned institutions and galleries. He also founded and ran the inaugural edition of Desh, Canada's South Asian Cultural Festival. His many awards and prizes include the Writers Guild of England Award for Television Drama and the Aga Khan Award for Excellence in the Arts. Jasbir Puar is Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. She is the author of the award-winning books The Right to Maim, Debility, Capacity, Disability, and Terrorist Assemblages, Homonationalism in Queer Times. Her scholarly and mainstream writings have been translated into more than 15 languages. She is on the advisory board of numerous organizations, including USA CBI and Disability Under Siege, a project focusing on disability in conflict zones. She is a 2019 Kessler Awardee, given by the Centre for Gay and Lesbian Studies, CLAGS, to scholars and activists whose work has significantly impacted queer research and organising. We are incredibly lucky to have them, so thanks so much to you all, and we are coming to you across many different time zones, so we are truly transnational today. Before we hand over to Rohit to ask our panel some questions, Bhavin from the project is going to give some brief reflections on global South Asian LGBTQ+ activism and his own incredible personal archive. And please do feel free to ask our panel questions in the YouTube chat as we go along. So over to you, Bhavin.
Thank you, Chiranjeet. I hope I'm clearly audible. So I've been involved with LGBT activism in India, in Eastern India in particular, since the early 90s. And I've been part of some of the earliest queer support forums in the country, and particularly Council Club and a journal that we used to publish called Pravartak. So with some, as I say, as fate would have it, I have a lot of material from Council Club and Pravartak with me, and which is now part of my work, part of my research work within Varta Trust, the non-profit that I now run. Varta focuses on gender and sexuality advocacy and publishing. And these letters, the Council Club archival material has almost 3,000 letters from the 90s and even earlier, and up to the early 2000s, before the internet invaded our lives. So these letters have a lot of interesting histories, a lot of interesting micro histories, as I would like to call them. And migration is also a very important element of these stories. So, and as part of this research, I have been looking at the archives, and it's not voluminous, but there are quite a few letters of South Asians or Indians who went over to the UK, migrated to the UK, or came back, or there are people from the UK who came to India to for work or for holiday or for meeting friends and family. So there are a number of histories, a number of stories in there, which I think are going to contribute to this research in a very important manner. Personally, I think it's a very interesting situation for me because I've never migrated, but I've been witnessing migrations throughout the life of Council Club through the 90s, when a lot of people from Kolkata and other parts of India who were associated with Council Club left the country. Many of them went over to the UK. And the reason behind these migrations was often not just career, but also, getting away from an environment where they felt they couldn't be themselves. So, and I mean, I'm witnessing these migrations even today. So I'm really interested in seeing where this research leads to and what kind of learning I have from the research. And I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion today, and a very big thank you to all the panelists for joining us. So that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Chunjit and Pawan, for setting us up with this very important context and background for the conversations that we are going to be having today. And I'm so delighted that we have 4 fantastic panelists with us who have played such an important role in LGBTQ organizing in the diaspora through their writing and cultural activism. So I want to kind of start off really with some of the points, Pawan, that you've made about a lot of people moving from India abroad, but also how they have become a very much part of the global LGBTQ organizing. So I kind of want to start off by asking Shundeep and Jasbir to reflect a bit on your queer organizing back in the 90s in the US. And I also understand that you both are having this conversation after a very long time. So I'm very pleased to hear some of your reflections. How was South Asia LGBTQ organizing back then? Was there much overlap with other movements? So over to you, Jasbir and Shundeep.
Sandeep, do you want to start?
Well, since I was trying to figure out how to unmute myself and was slow, you should go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Let's see. So I moved. So I moved to the Bay Area in the mid '90s for graduate school, and that's where TRICON had been established. I believe Sandeep, you had already been working with TRICON and had started the magazine at that point in time. So one of the things that was really amazing about that time was that there was just a kind of Insta community that was available and incredibly welcoming for anyone who was able to who showed up to a meeting or was able to connect at an event. So that was I think one of the most important things that was going on at the time. There were South Asian LGBT organizations being formed everywhere. There was a TRICON Atlanta. There was the South Asian Lesbian and Gay Association in New York City. There was another kind of offshoot of TRICON in LA and Chicago, et cetera, et cetera. So this was a time really of a kind of explosion of cultural production, film, connection. There was intense debates about visibility, what it meant to be the only one in a certain space, and what it meant to be actually to be able to gather and no longer be the only one. And this was in San Francisco before the .com bust as well. So there was really a kind of robust artistic community, I think, and a robust kind of almost subcultural community at that time. This was also a time when anti-immigration policies were and quote unquote immigration reform, welfare reform was happening under Clinton, the Defense of Marriage Act, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, all of these things we were kind of navigating. For me, one of the most important things that happened during that time was the connection between South Asian feminist organizing and South Asian LGBTQ organizing. So I worked with Narika, which had been recently established as a helpline for intimate partner violence for South Asian women. And we were also connected to other Asian Pacific Islander communities, for example, like the Asian Women's Shelter, which was the only shelter of that kind at that time. And so those of us who were working in this kind of conjuncture between feminist and queer organizing, we were addressing the fact that TRICON was predominantly that there were fewer women, that there were fewer lesbians. This was a kind of common problem at the time as well. How to think about gender in a way that didn't reinforce binaries, but also, kind of destabilized the kind of dominance of male voices in the organization. But we were also becoming part of conversations in this that were happening really for the first time in a really explicit manner about intimate partner violence in queer relationships. So one of the things that we did was organize with NARIC a kind of specific outreach to South Asian LGBT folks around domestic violence and intimate partner violence. So that crossover was really one of the things that I found kind of foundational and the kind of, you know, coalitional work that was going on at that time. I mean, the second thing I think that was always kind of present for me, and I say this thing about, you know, kind of finally not being the only one and being kind of connected in this way. But I had for a long time been the only Sikh in these spaces, and so was kind of the only one in this place where everyone had been the only one and was no longer necessarily identifying in that way, and so that always, you know, that kind of confusion about why am I the only Sikh and, you know, where are those folks? And I'm interested to talk about Diasporas because that's where I started meeting more queer Sikhs. But there was, you know, the question of anti-Muslim and Islamophobic issues were really starting to come to the fore. We invited Ashok Rokavi one year to be part of one of the conferences that we held, or one of the Pride parades, and it was really, really hard to say, wait a second, why are we inviting this person who is, you know, a right-wing activist in India, even though he's the most visible activist at the time, right? It wasn't. So Trikon was very Hindu dominant at that time, was my experience of it, and that there wasn't really a way to start addressing these issues. And of course, this is during the time when Modi was like coming to power, right? And the BJP was starting to consolidate more power. So these are just some of the things. So I want to both say that this was like an incredible thing for me. I was a young person. I was newly finding my way in these spaces. We had amazing conferences. We had the Pride Utsav in 1995, which was just, you know, people came from all over the different diasporas and gathered, and it was an incredibly energizing and also very erotic space that we were all inhabiting. And when we found, you know, we were all finding each other. It was like the kind of brown drug. It was really incredible. And so I don't want to minimize that at all, you know, but just talking about some of the growing pains and some of the ways in which we were all coming to consciousness around the India-centric nature of the organization, around the Hindu-centric nature of the organization, around gender and trying to figure out questions of gender parity, around generational differences, around the differences between folks who had migrated from India and those of us born in the United States. That's just a little bit of context. Sandeep, I'm so interested in what you want to say or add or correct me about, because you have the more chronicling kind of archive that you've kept for all these years.
Thanks. And it's before I start, I wanted to thank both Chunjit and Rohit for putting this together, because if nothing else, it's just wonderful to see Jasbir and Ian and Ritu, people whom we haven't, you know, I've known years and years and haven't seen in years and years. So it's brings a lot of memories flooding back. Desh Pradesh was probably one of the first events I went to as a queer person. But I think to just carry on from what Jasbir was saying, for me as a person growing up in Kolkata, I was one of the first to, Trikon actually predates me. It was a 4-page stapled newsletter that used to be mailed out of California. It started in 1986. And I was one of the first 2 subscribers to Trikon in Kolkata. and I put in a personal ad in it just to find the other person, hoping I could find the other person. And and the amazing thing was, I thought only people in Kolkata would respond to that ad. But years later, like 4 years later, I had already gone to the United States and was studying there, and there were still people writing letters in response to that personal ad that were ending up at home with some unforeseen results, as his letters showing up from Ludhiana and wherever else, Manipal, and I'm like, oops, I didn't quite mean to. It wasn't like a post box that you couldn't get a post box in India those days easily. So it was, you had to have letters come to your home address. But I think to piggyback on what Jasbir was saying, I think for most of us, many of us, and I'm speaking for myself here, were accidental activists. We didn't get in there for any reason of activism. We just got in there because we wanted to, as Jasbir put it, not be the only person, the only gay in the village. So we wanted to find other people like ourselves where we could be both South Asian and gay at the same time. And I should say that until I became part of Trikon, I didn't even think of myself as South Asian at all. I just thought of my identity as Indian, perhaps Bengali, Kolkatan, were the things. And these identities grew as with each plane you boarded on your journey of immigration. So you became from Kolkatan to Bengali to Indian, and then suddenly you were South Asian, and then you were Asian in America, which was a whole different ballgame, because when you went to an Asian bar, people were like, what are you doing in an Asian bar? You don't look Asian. You look more Latino than Asian. So it was because it was all about racial features and all of that. So that South Asian identity, and I think it's quite right, because the Trikon started in the Bay Area. It was started by 2 Indian engineers. And because of the way immigration worked, Trikon was from the outset not just Indian dominated or Hindu dominated. It was basically a gay Indian engineer organization. And then it sort of diversified, and you would find the Bangladeshis moving in, or women, and there was a lot of growing pains with it, because I think, like many organizations, it struggled with trying to figure out whether it was a social organization, what was meant for potlucks and get-togethers, or was it a political organization. We had heated debates about whether Trikon should even march in the India Day Parade, given India's relationships with its neighbors in South Asia. And so if you march in the India Day Parade, then should you go to the Pakistan Mela and ask for a booth there? These were all questions that we had to confront, and many of us were comfortable in marching in a pride parade down Main Street in San Francisco, but did not want to march in an India Day parade in sort of the heart of Fremont, which was sort of the Indian center in town. But I think, and I actually have a post the program from one of the DCQ conferences that we did, and DCQ. The first one happened as a result of the 25th anniversary of Stonewall, when a lot of us had gone to New York for the Stonewall anniversary. And so the group there in New York, Salga, put together a 2-day conference. And then we thought, this is wonderful meeting all of us. So let's try and do this every couple of years. And so then Trikon hosted a DCQ. And for the first one, we had Urvashi Ved came to speak. The poet Ifti Nasim from Chicago came to speak. Well, for the second one, we actually fundraised and specifically to address some of these gender issues. We only raised money to bring women from South Asia. We brought 5 or 6 women from different organizations all over South Asia to the conference. And I think as a result of being so few, it actually caused a sort of global diaspora to grow. So, so Trikon was connected with Desh Pradesh in Toronto, with Rung magazine coming out in Vancouver. We knew about Shakti Khabar coming out in London. We knew about Club Kali. The first time I went to London, I had to figure out how to sort of sneak out of my aunt's house to go to Club Kali, and there were no Ubers and things back then, and then try and get a mini cab to go back to Northwest London after the event. But we would go, I had copies of Shakti Khabar, we had copies of Bombay Those coming out in India. So it was actually a sort of global network because there were so few, we really actually needed to lean on each other in order to get along. And now I think, what has changed a lot is that there is a lot more visibility out there. There's a lot more organizations out there. And in fact, I think the need for a magazine like Trikone, which I edited for 52 issues. And the most wonderful thing was that we didn't think that, I used to always think every time I edited an issue, it was a quarterly magazine. And every time I edited an issue, I was like, shit, what are we going to do for the next issue? I mean, how much queer South Asian content can we keep generating? And for 52 issues that I edited, and then way beyond that, we kept generating more and more. And I think it's still, now working as a journalist, it moves me immensely as to how many people we just approach blindly saying, we write this magazine, will you write for us? Will you share something with us? We had no money. We were entirely volunteer driven. And everybody, from Aga Shahid Ali to Firdaus Kanga to the writer Ruskin Bond, Vikram Seth, all of these people were happy to share their work for this magazine, because they believed that we were trying to do something. And I think we've come a long way from the time when a book where on page 203 there was some kind of a little queer scene, and so we'll do a feature story in Trikone about this magazine. Or I remember there was a movie called Fresh Kill where Sarita Chaudhary, who was in Mississippi Masala, plays a lesbian, but she's not even South Asian in that film. It was directed by Shuli Chang. She plays like a sort of indeterminate. We were like, no matter, we're going to do a cover story on Sarita Chaudhary for playing a lesbian. And I think we've come a long way from that, where there's a lot more content, a lot more to choose from, which is wonderful. But I think what is wonderful also about this panel is that until you know your history, none of us know, on what the foundation has been built. And I think some of these conversations around gender representation, diversity that Jaspreet was alluding to are issues that affect us even more now, because in some sense, we were forced to, some people would often joke that Trikone was one of the few organizations that was actually South Asian, because we had Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, Nepalis on the organization board because there were so few of us. But other organizations, there were just enough, if there are enough gay South Indian for people from Andhra Pradesh around, they can just hang out with each other and feel no need to meet a more diverse group. So in that sense, it was a growing pain. And I also agree with Jaspreet. It was an instant community that was there, and that was the biggest thing they gave us. And I remember a Bangladeshi American friend of mine and a white friend both moved to the Bay Area at the same time. And the white guy said, I am so pissed and jealous. The Bangladeshi American had like this ready-built little community to flock into. As soon as he came, he had invitations to potlucks and things every day, every weekend. And I have to like figure it out for myself. And we're like, there's white privilege, and then there's the other side of white privilege. You have it easy in many other ways. At least we got a potluck now and then.
Thank you so much, Shrandeep and Jaspreet. I think both of you have just given us so much food for thought. And just picking up on two things, you both mentioned Desh Pradesh and also the role of culture. So I'm going to move on to our two creative producers over here, Ian and Ritu. And you've both, again, you've been such pioneers in the work that you've done, and you've worked in Canada and in the UK. And the role that you've played in the Desh Pradesh Festival. So I was just hoping you could tell us a little bit more about it for those who don't know what this is all about. And then also if you want to reflect a little bit on your role as kind of, creative producers and what role you think that has played in LGBTQ South Asian activism. So Ian and Ritu.
Ritu, would you like to begin?
I thought you were going to begin, darling.
All right. Well, I'll dive in first, but jump in. First of all, thank you for inviting me, and it is lovely to see these familiar faces, as Sandeep pointed out. And a lot of what Sandeep and Jasbir talked about in terms of early organizing in San Francisco really resonates for me back in my Toronto days. Desh Pradesh, you know, it seems so arrogant to kind of define it from this distance 30 years later and talk about what the theorizing was behind it and the planning, because it was really just organic. It happened because we needed it. We were there, we were young, we had energy, we wanted to get laid, all of the above. And that's kind of, you know, how it evolved. It started from a lesbian and gay organization called Kush, which very sadly became primarily a gay. We were talking about culture and family and coming out and being gay. And, you know, one of the things we recognized. Can you hear me? Yeah?
We can hear you, Ian.
Hello? Have I been sent out?
Yeah, I think you're just cutting out a bit, but we can hear you.
Okay. Okay, fine. You all left suddenly. So, I mean, you know, one of the things we recognized in Kush is that our priorities were obviously different from the white gay community, and the coming out process required a different kind of narrative for us. And it required, however painful, the presence of family and community in ways that we weren't ready to necessarily let go of, as many of our kind of white friends and lovers and counterparts you know, we're willing to sacrifice. We started to create events for not just ourselves, but the larger South Asian community. And initially, that mimicked a lot of cultural events that were taking place within Toronto. Culture, South Asian culture meant Indian. It meant North Indian. It meant mostly kind of Hindu-centric. Whereas, you know, the migration in Canada was so varied and featured people like myself whose families have been many generations in East Africa and the Caribbean, you know, from all over the world with kind of different incarnations of what South Asian meant. So we wanted to celebrate that. But we also wanted to create a space where our families and larger communities might be welcome. You know, the point was not to create a sort of private space, although, you know, we valued that and did that as well, but to actually create a larger space where we could talk about queerness in all its forms with our families and communities. And also to celebrate diasporic South Asian culture in the broadest sense, you know, not just harking back to this mythical homeland that many of us had no real relationship with, but talking about how culture was being defined in this new place, you know, in Canada and in the US and in the Caribbean and in the UK, which was a big reference point for us, and I think is one of the reasons why I'm living here now. So it was exploring all of those things. So we had, you know, in our early, I really only sort of curated the first year, but, you know, we had people like Pratibha Parmar and Sunil Gupta, but we also had Michael Andachi, you know, and Moise Vasanji, and amongst others. And so there was definitely a queer inflection to it, and it was an unapologetic queer reflection, but we wanted to create a space where our queerness could interact, and with the end goal being of you know, a kind of transformational South Asian community. And in terms of how it's, you know, at the time I was a poet and was beginning to publish, and later I kind of went on to do film and television work as well as continue to curate. And I think, you know, it was whether consciously or unconsciously the issues of that time, which are sadly still relevant today, have sort of insinuated themselves into my consciousness and continue to fuel and inspire my creative work. Yeah, I'll leave it for there. Ritu.
Thanks so much, Ian, and also thank you very much, Rohit and Charanjit, for putting together this panel. It truly is just so wonderful to finally meet Shundip and Jasbir and and reconnect with Ian as well. So actually, I would echo a lot of what you've said, Ian. I think Shivananda Khan's motivation for setting up Shakti way back in 1988 was broadly based upon connecting people, just simply making sure that those of us that were South Asian origin living in the UK could be around people that were reflections of ourselves, because we found ourselves, if we were going out and about on the LGBTQ scene, to often be in a minority, if not even be the only one in the room. And then there were lots of people that had, were not out at all and weren't going out on any kind of scene whatsoever. So, and I certainly remember that when Shiv invited me to become part of the management committee and an early founder member of Shakti, I didn't quite know what I was getting into, but I was so excited by it, absolutely so excited. And that very first meeting that I went to at London Friend in Caledonian Road in near King's Cross in London, to be sitting around a table for the first time with 20 or so other South Asian LGBTQ people was just, it was like coming home. It was like, it was enough to make me cry and might make me cry again now. So it was really, really special. And anything beyond that didn't really matter, quite frankly, at first. Later down the line, we did need to sort of establish whether we were a social organisation or a political one or what. And I think we tried to do a mix of everything. The disco, which I have a personal interest in, was specifically set up to fundraise for Shakti. And one thing we did try and do with the disco is we tried to make it as secular as possible. We marked all of the festivals. We celebrated Eid, we celebrated Diwali, we celebrated Vaisakhi and Navratri. And I would say, actually, in terms of the organising committee, we were quite well spread. We were multi-faith. There was a good representation of women, a good balance, gender balance, so I think we did a lot of things right, and I think we changed lives for so many people. We changed our own lives for the better. It was a chance to be able to embrace our culture, embrace our sexuality, and do both of those things and achieve that intersectionality in a really positive way that we'd not been able to do before. Shiv was very inspired by the organisations that had sprung up in other cities abroad. Bombay Dost was an inspiration for him. So was Trikon, Kush when it appeared, it was very strengthening and reinforcing to be part of what was a global family of some kind, even though back in those days we weren't able to connect on social media because there wasn't any social media or internet. So we just connected by phone and fax and newsletters by post, these mail outs that were sent everywhere. But it was really great to know that there were, we'd gone from being the only one to being part of a huge chosen family that was international, and that was great. And of course, for me personally, to have been invited to perform at Desh Pradesh in the early 90s, it kind of illustrated exactly what that part of that global family could look like in the most wonderful way.
Thanks so much for that, Ritu and Ian. I think, fascinating stuff. And one of the things I've kind of picked up, and I kind of want to ask you both to reflect a bit more, is about this tension between, is it a social organization? Is it a political organization? Can it be both? And what kind of tension was there, in terms of organizing on those lines? And I'm just thinking even now, the way in which that tension continues to play out. So Ritu, maybe if I can ask you a little bit about Club Kali and the importance of that club space for LGBTQ South Asians in this country, and how did you mentioned about kind of disco coming up as a fundraiser, but also the importance of the space itself. I mean, I can think one of the first things I did when I came to this country was actually make my way to Club Kali, like Shundeep, and decades later, of course. So it's obviously like a rite of passage for us when we come to this country. So yeah, if you want to tell us a little bit about that, and then I've got more questions for others.
Yep. Okay, Rohit. Thank you. So Club Kali grew out of Shakti Disco, and my experience of working there. I think with Kali, I always wanted it to be a place that was very hospitable and welcoming, in the same way that I would welcome people into my home. That's how I wanted people to feel when they came to Club Kali. And for me, it was also about a lot of cultural exchange, and not being completely insular as LGBTQs of South Asian origin. And I think that was reflected in the music mix, which I had pieced together and developed for Shakti. So, being somebody at that time in the late 80s to the mid 90s, when we set up Club Kali in 1995, it was a place where you could come and hear ragga and swing and soul and disco and house, as well as Bhangra and Bollywood and Arabic music and just everything. And I really wanted everybody that felt like they were other culturally to feel welcome at Club Kali. So subsequently, we engaged an audience that included Turks and Greeks and Arabs, and just everybody came there. But mostly what was happening, or the feel, the environment, the incense, the agarbatti, the predominance of South Asian music and faces meant that we were, for once, in the majority, and that sent out a very strong message, I think, of controlling a space on our terms. Sometimes the personal is political, and I think a lot of what I do and have always done has been about unconsciously, subconsciously decolonizing dance floors, and decolonizing club spaces and entertainment spaces. But there is a political there's a political result from that. So that's what I would say. We were very clear that we didn't want Club Kali to try and replace Shakti as an organization. We didn't want the headache, quite frankly. We got some of the headache anyway, though. In terms of the informal counselling, the pastoral care, you can't really run a space like that without getting close to your customers and getting close to the people that come there. They do start to feel like family. There's a lot of bonds that get struck up. We've also seen and successive generations of people have grown up with us, so we've had that kind of intimacy, which has involved looking after people as much as we possibly can.
Thanks, Ritu. And I think that pastoral care and that involvement is so important. And Ian, which kind of brings me on to you and your work. I literally remember watching your films in Kolkata's film festivals or in pirated DVDs, and the significance of surviving Sabu and Touch of Pink to the wider South Asian LGBT community, cannot be underestimated. So I just and I don't know how many people also know about your other film Stag, which I really enjoyed as well. And I just want to know if you want to tell a little bit about, how did they come about? But more importantly, someone like me who's watching, or people who will be watching it now, what was the reception back then, when Surviving Sabu or Touch of Pink was shown to people?
Complicated and mixed. First of all, they were incredibly hard to get films like that made at that time. Touch of Pink took almost 10 years of heavy lifting to finally get to screen. And I have to say, very gratefully and thankfully, we're in a moment right now, however long it lasts, where it's suddenly becoming easier. I wish I was a little bit younger to enjoy it, but when I started to make film and video, it was pretty tough. Touch of Pink had a very mixed reaction. It's sort of it's set in a Smiley Muslim South Asian community, which is my community, and it's a very personal story, although it's a kind of fantasy structure. But it was very much about my coming out process and my relationship to my family. And I received a lot of hostile responses from the community because it felt like I was airing dirty laundry. And I spent almost the next year trying to kind of deal with it because, I saw my first audience I saw as a South Asian queer audience, but I also wanted to make it for the Ismaili community and other sort of straight South Asian communities, because that's half the coming out process. It's not just about queer people, it's about the straight people, right? So, and the tone of the film it's very feel good. It's quite light on the surface. It's quite fluffy, but underneath it's about internalized racism and homophobia, and about the barriers to coming out in a South Asian context. So I tried to the thinking behind it was both kind of political and personal. I wanted to create a piece of activism as well as a film that could be enjoyed and processed, and I wanted it to be kind of activism without the hair shirt. I wanted it to offer pleasure first and perhaps thought and action later.
Thanks for that, Ian. I do have a follow-up, but I might come back to you in a bit. Jasbir, let me move on to you. Again, I think this is becoming like I'm kind of repeating myself, but again, your work has been path-breaking as well for us, LGBTQ scholars, South Asian LGBT people. And especially, the argument that you've made, about kind of, how gay rights gets co-opted within imperial capital projects, and, the kind of complicity with settler colonialism, Islamophobia, and other forms of racism. And I wonder if you wanted to kind of maybe touch a little bit about, and you did kind of, when you began, about the situation that's currently in South Asia. There is a resurgence of nationalism, but at the same time, there is also being kind of the co-option of LGBTQ rights. And so I was wondering if you wanted to comment a bit on that and how you see that's playing out right now.
I think that, it's somewhat predictable how it's playing out right now, because we saw it happening in the 90s. We saw the BJP coming to power. We saw, Modi's beginning to consolidate, his political postures. So it's, none of this is surprising to me about what's happening. I think that we, this division between social and political was always, for me, it was always a way of actually not having to tackle this very, very real problem of what was actually happening in India around anti-Muslim and Islamophobic kind of gatekeeping around citizenship. So, Sandeep mentioned the India Day Parade, the formation of the India Day Parade as a kind of activist agenda, right? And that was both the case. I think Tricone was interested in, you know, we had debates about whether or not we wanted to march in that parade. Salga really took that up as an activist initiative that I think went on for about a decade or so. And then it finally happened. And I personally never understood this desire to be recognized in the India Day parade. So I was always, you know, part of these initiatives on the side, protesting the parade, but supporting the people, you know, who wanted to be in the parade. And it finally happened in New York City with Salga in, like, I don't know, 2001. This was right before 9/11. I really think 9/11 changed everything in terms of the organizing that we were forced to do, which is we started moving away from a kind of identity-based organizing in the United States. And it really was about looking about increased harassment and violence and hate crimes, our communities being dismantled by detention and deportation, a kind of growing solidarity between South Asian communities and their queer community members. So that's, you know, for me, that was also when I started seeing pretty coherent splits between South Asian queer diaspora communities that were on board with challenging Islamophobia in the United States and those that were not, you know. And I will never forget, you know, one of the meetings that we had with Salga, for example, after the 2002 pogroms in India, right? Where we had several people who refused to march in the gay pride parade with a sign condemning the pogroms, right? We started seeing, this was also the result of diversification, really, is that we started having conservative and right-wing folks who wanted to be part of these organizing initiatives, but refused to actually take on. So, you know, there's a critique of homophobia, transphobia of the Indian nation state, but then a reproduction of these kinds of hierarchies between caste, between class, between religion, you know, even between region. One of the things that I really appreciated about Diasporas in particular is that you didn't have the kind of UK, Canada, US diaspora, that kind of triadic formation so central to Diasporas, because you had so many people from earlier migration histories from the Caribbean, from Trinidad, from Fiji, etc., that really broke that kind of dominance. So these are the kinds of things that I started writing about, and again became very, very apparent to me after 9/11 that there are South Asian queers committed to Hindutva, and what are we going to do about that? How are we going to think through those community relations?
Yeah, Jasbir, and I think that debate continues. I'm sure Pawan will tell us about some of the things we have heard as well with organizing currently happening in Kolkata, but also in India, and there's been lots of kind of pushback as well, and I'm sure Shundeep would be able to reflect on that as well. So thanks for that. I think it's so important that that complicity is definitely discussed. Shundeep, I know we're running out of time, but I do want to ask you a little bit about this kind of concept of home itself, as someone who migrated and came back to India as well. And I remember reading your piece in Gautam Bhan and Arvind Narayan's book, about kind of returning home and then coming home, and this very lovely concept of home, how you had to leave and go to San Francisco, but then also coming back to India now. And I just wondered if you wanted to maybe tell a little bit about that, and how have you seen that change? Those kind of hidden stories that you've mentioned in your book, and what is it like to leave home and find home again, really? Oh, Shundeep, you're mute. You're on mute.
There we go. I think the search for home is obviously a huge cliche of the immigrant story. Anyway, we write about it all the time. But I think for queer people search for home from our part of the world at least, search for home in a different way. There is a different poignancy to that search because we at least came of age in a generation where home was not home. Home was not necessarily the safest place to be. Home was a place that you had to get away from in order to feel at home with who you were. So in a sense, groups like Trikone, Salga, Kush, all of these were our way of trying to cobble together a sense of home somewhere else. And I think many of the splits that Jasbir is talking about came out of that. We were so anxious to cobble this sense of home, this safe space around a potluck in somebody's kitchen, that we wanted to paper over the differences that existed with why should a queer community be different from the larger community they came from? It will be bedeviled by the same forces around racism, even self-hate, homophobia, even, as well as Islamophobia. Anything that's happening in the larger society will be reflected. In the gay LGBT community, we may guise it by saying, we only want to be focused on queer issue. We don't want to deal with caste. We don't want to deal with pogroms in Gujarat. We don't want to hold signs for that. We'll only hold signs for Section 377. That is the only thing that we, or marriage or whatever. And obviously, our lives are not so compartmentalized. Our lives are messier, and we spill apart in different ways. And I think, in that sense, we try to create this sense of home with, and of course, as Jasbir knows, from experience with Narika and all of these, home is also the place which is often the most dangerous for us, and it is the place where we spend a lot of time trying to pretend that all is well, that that there is no place like home, that this is all going to be wonderful. And I think one of the telling things about that was in Trikone in the 90s, when we were part of this organization, almost nobody who came, this is the AIDS crisis is happening in the United States. My friends who were part of Trikone, who tested positive, never came out in a Trikone setting to talk about being positive. This happened in Canada when ASAP and all these projects started out, but there was that sense of shame that was in the larger community around the stigma of AIDS and HIV persisted even in the gay community. When we were doing when we did an issue on HIV/AIDS for Trikone, it was hard to find anybody who wanted to write about it, especially in their own with their own name. So this was, these were these things that we talk about home carry with us. And so when I come back to India, I realize, I think this comes with age, that you don't come looking for home. You just look for a small space in which you can find a comfort zone. But I think this quest for home is always mythical because it will always leave you wanting. Right now, as a sort of twice-cooked immigrant, I think there will not be a place where I will not miss the other in some fashion or the other. A part of me will always find home in the fog of San Francisco. And when I'm in San Francisco in the fog, I'll complain about the fog and long for, the Indian monsoon summer and things like that. So, but that's the nature of who we are. And so in a way, somebody early on talked about the chosen family, which in a way, what this picture on the screen illustrates, that is as good as home as it gets for me.
Thanks a lot for that, Shundeep. Absolutely. I think I every time I go back to Calcutta, I'm complaining about things in over there. When I'm in London, I'm like, I can't wait to go back to Calcutta. So it's one of those things, isn't it? I'm just going to say that the conversation's really going well. So we have decided to have another few minutes of this. So we'll carry on until 2:10 UK time. If anyone's got any questions, please feel free, if you're on Facebook, if you're on YouTube, to put your comments over there, and our panel will pick up some questions. We have got one question so far. Most of the comments we've got so far is basically how amazing to have all four of you here today. So that's what most of the comments are, which is great. But if you've got questions for them, please do ask as well. So one question that we have is, thank you so much for this initiative, so brilliant, so much to learn. I often wonder about the right to asylum in a queer context. Could this finally help queer international relations? So I'm wondering who wants to talk about it. I mean, I don't want to say anything because it's just awful in the UK, and having seen some of my friends go through the process, it's pretty demeaning. And but yeah, others who want to come in. Ian?
Actually, can I quickly
Oh,
make
yeah.
one quick point about asylum? I think it raises a lot of very knotty issues for us. I remember in the early days of Tricon, we were often asked to provide sort of references for people seeking asylum in the thing, and it always created this problem and discussion within the group. As at one level, we were talking about groups like Sakyani or Humsafar Trust and all of these groups starting Pravartak, starting up in India and parts of South Asia. Could we at the same time talk about 377, as that India, that you needed to seek asylum from India, and yet there was obviously a right to asylum. And at the same time, there were people within the community who were undocumented, whose visas had lapsed. And we didn't know how to deal with that as a community. So these were all very tricky questions for us.
Definitely. Does anyone else want to come in on that?
Yeah, I could just add really briefly. The early 90s was when they lifted the I think they lifted the HIV restriction on immigration, and then there were we had the kind of first asylees coming from various places. The way asylum set up is completely geopolitical. So, for example, Pakistan gets focused on very heavily around this asylum process in the 90s. There was a whole crew of Pakistani queers who, both in that process of narration, you both have to appear to be gay, but then also say that you were too persecuted in your home country to be gay, and so this is the kind of narrative contradiction that the lawyers were working with. And there were groups of really progressive movement lawyers, trying to figure out these asylum cases. As Sandeep mentioned, like we would get called in to be kind of expert testimony. And at the time I was looking at kind of Indo and Afro Trinidadian organizing in Trinidad, and would get called to testify to the kind of backwardness of Indian culture in Trinidad, which of course I did not want to do. So I think, just to reiterate what Sandeep was saying, that it actually put many of us in these very contradictory positions, while also kind of reinforcing the geopolitical interests, for example, of the United States to continue to vilify Pakistan as a kind of particular problematic site.
Thanks for that, Jasbir. So we've got another question, and I'll open that up as well. How engaged do you think the younger generations are on continuing the work you have done? What do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities? So Ritu, if I start with you this time.
I'm really quite inspired by a lot of the younger people that I see who are incredibly active as activists, really clued up, fired up, passionate, and then they've got all kinds of digital skills that I would love to possess. I think there's a great new wave of younger activists coming up, and I do think it would be good to have more opportunities for intergenerational discussion and exchange, where we could learn from each other, and I feel that we don't get a chance to do that often enough. Obviously, because I'm still in clubland, I do get a chance to do a bit of that face to face when I'm actually at Club Kali. But I think we need more forums for this to take place.
Thanks, Ritu. Ian, do you want to add anything to this?
Yes, I mean, to echo Ritu. I'm really excited. I feel like queer South Asian activism has kind of skipped a couple of generations. I mean, sort of from our time, it went quiet for a while, and and things got quite splintered. I felt, and finally ethnicized. You had your Sri Lankan queer groups, and you had your Ismaili Muslims queer. It got very specific, but I feel there's a kind of generation coming up that is both proudly South Asian, but also work with other people of color communities and other activist communities, and what they're doing is inspiring. I also agree with Ritu that there is something ahistorical about these movements. Most of them aren't aware of the work that we did. Some of them don't know about Trikone or Kush or Desh or Shakti. I'm currently working on a TV series, which I'm finding extremely exciting because the lead and co-creator is a young trans performer. And I think a lot of the activism that's really interesting is coming from trans and gender fluid communities, South Asian and otherwise, and really kind of reigniting issues that we were grappling with back in the day around gender and sexuality, but from a different angle. But ironically, some of the young South Asian people attached to this show, which is being shot in Toronto, so they said to me, "Oh, do you remember something called Desh Pradesh? Apparently there was this festival back in the day, and it's like, yeah." And I wish there was more of a connective tissue from the activism and organizing we did to what's going on today, because I think it would become more powerful and richer.
Yeah, yes, absolutely, Ian. And I was just thinking, reflecting on another panel, Chunjit and I've been with Neil, and some of these kind of intergenerational dialogues, talking about that, and kind of the lack of some of those histories kind of being there today with the new kind of South Asian queer creatives, and so on. But I've got two more questions. So and I know we are running out of time. So let me pick up the first question.
Oh, Rohit, I saw Jasbir and Ritu had their hands up, which make me think that there's.
Oh, I'm
so sorry. Some great points there.
Thank you for that. Jasbir, Ritu, do you want to come in very quickly?
Well, I wanted to.
I did actually.
Go ahead. So go ahead, Ritu.
Thank you. I just wanted to concur with some of what Ian said about there having been a kind of cavernous gulf between what we were doing in the 80s, the organising that we were doing in the 80s, maybe before that, and into the 90s, and then I think with the commercialisation of the LGBTQ scene, everything did go rather quiet as far as the activism was concerned. And just what you also said about this splintering, which also connects with what Jasbir said earlier on. I mean, we noticed a very clear fragmenting of this kind of pan-South Asian LGBTQ alliance in the UK, where everybody sort of wanted to be in their own individual religious groups, for example, and that very clearly happened after 9/11. I can just pinpoint it exactly when it happened, and it was such a shame. I just found it incredibly sad. So it is nice to see this resurgence of people coming together, people also making those connections under what the kind of political black umbrella that we did back in the 80s. And I don't know if the Black Lives Matter movement has actually propelled that more recently. But yes, that's what I just wanted to throw in.
Jasbir?
Yeah, I wanted to just stress the question of intergenerational conversations, and I don't know if it, for my sense, I'm not sure if I have a sense of there being a gulf, or if the kind of organizing shifted, and if it shifted from organizing as South Asian queer or organized around religion. But I also think a lot of that organizing started feeding into other movement organizing. So, for example, around Palestine and queerness, There are South Asians who have been doing that organizing as part of a kind of solidarity movement. And you see, for example, with the Students for Justice and in Palestine organizations on US campuses, a lot of South Asian queers, a lot of South Asians in general, who are predominantly Muslim, but then a lot of them who are queer as well, a part of that solidarity organizing. So I didn't see it so much as things went quiet, but it definitely started moving in ways that weren't part of the way that we had understood, you know, our own organizing. And I did want to kind of make sure I got in here because I into this question because I really wanted to emphasize, you know, the growth of Sikh queer organizing has been tremendous. And that has been, it's been really powerful because there's been a need to address the homophobia and transphobia that exists in Sikh communities and in the Gurdwara communities in all of the diasporas. And so the farmers' protest has been a huge catalyst for non-binary, trans, Sikh, and particularly Sikh Dalit organizing. So anti-caste organizing is actually one of the core precepts right now for Sikh queer organizing, particularly in California, where there are a number of, and they are young, and there is a kind of generational conversation missing. But you know, I'm learning from them, and I feel incredibly lucky. First, you know, to be able to that they're a kind of you know, making it possible for me to be part of this organizing that's getting you know, caste recognized as a category of oppression and discrimination in California schools, in California state legislations, but also that the organizing that's happening now, you know, gives me pause and makes me think, wow, we never really talked enough about caste, right? We didn't, you know, how much caste privileged organizing is going on in our queer spaces. So this is one of the questions that they've been asking, which is, you know, when is Sarbat, for example, going to address the question of caste privilege and casteism in our queer community? So I see, you know, very and that you know, that organizing is connected to Black Lives Matter, for example, to Kashmir, to Palestine. So I feel really inspired and also you know, like weirdly like an elder, which is so strange, but then as the elder, realizing how much we didn't know or we didn't understand or how much we had to work through in order to get somewhere else, right? So I wanted to give a shout out to all of those kind of Sikh Dalit organizing folks, because their organizing has accelerated because of the farmers' protests in India, and how the conversations about the farmers' protests have been driven by a Sikh commitment to anti-casteism, for example, in the practice of langar, but hasn't addressed the problem of gender, right? And kind of violence towards women and the community and all the rest of it. And so you see the anti-casteism and the non-binary gender stuff coming together as one, right? Like this is actually an organizing agenda that makes sense in terms of dismantling both gender and caste at the same time.
Thank you so much for that, Jaspir. That's a fantastic place to actually end this conversation today. We've got more questions, but unfortunately, we are not going to have time. But thank you so much. I want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for being here today, for having this fantastic conversation with us. I'll pass on to Chunjit to close.
Thank you so much. Just picking up from a few things in the comments, just for people to think about afterwards. You know, if we could have gone on for longer, we could have talked about social media and what's changed in the digital world, but maybe there'll be a part 2 of this panel in the future. Kabir Man in the comments on YouTube was also pointing out the creation of South Asian Queer Archives at the Bishopsgate Institute in London. And I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had about what happens when institutions and types of grassroots activism come together. And I think we're in a really interesting moment now where we have to critically engage with who's keeping what who's safeguarding what knowledge, what gets collected, what doesn't get collected, how it's kept, who it's for, and how it's made accessible. This has been an amazing panel. I've been lucky enough to jot some notes as we're going along. I want to give you my highlights from the past hour. Places we've been, like the US, Canada, Kashmir, Palestine, East Africa, the Caribbean, types of issues we've talked about where a history of activism has helped us to rethink caste discrimination, types of gender discrimination, ways in which we can build and remake more inclusive futures. Historical events, so early migrations across often parts of empire that I think a lot of, especially younger South Asians in the UK, don't even know about. They just think about Canada and the UK. There's stuff from across the world. Like in my family, we came via Malaysia and Singapore. The history of feminist activism and how it intersects with different types of LGBT and queer activism, and how those histories converge and diverge at different points, and how that brings in different conversations. AIDS, 9/11, the farmers' protest. These are stories that I hope people can see. I think sometimes people see LGBTQ queer histories as these silos. No, they connect to every type of social and political imaginary that we can think of. They have made different political moments. And it's not a homogenous community. So I know we use community in this problematic way to try and imagine a connection, but it's also so important to stay attuned to differences, which people have pointed out. In the comments, I just want the panel to know there have been so many people who have said, I did not know this. I think the power of connecting these creative paths is something that gives us hope now at a time that we need hope urgently. And in different types of hostile environments, we can connect, create, and activate, not just for necessary erotic reasons, but also to create better places around us. And some of the most amazing comments, like thrice cooked immigrant, that's going to stay with me for the rest of the day. That's brilliant. And the idea of our identities being remade every time we board a plane, it is happening all of the time. And things happening because we need them. I think that's something we need to think about now. What is it that we need now? And how do we create it? And the idea of an international chosen family, I think for the past hour, I'm choosing you as my international family. What an amazing bunch of people. I hope you can stay in touch with the project. Our Twitter handle has been streaming down the bottom there, CBQ Desi, and you can look us up. We're very easy to find. But I just want to end again by saying thank you to these living legends for being with us. I hope we can continue the conversation. Thank you to South Asian Heritage Month. I'm giving you all an applause. Thank you. Does anybody